Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love.
Welcome to the Politics Guys. I'm political scientist Michael Baranowski, an emeritus professor at Northern Kentucky University. I'm joined today by Cleveland area attorney and defender of freedom, Jay Carson.
Hey, good morning, Mike.
Hey, Jay, how are you doing this morning?
On the advice of counsel, I declined to answer based on my privileges under the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution.
Probably wise, and we all know how likely it is that I will be setting a perjury trap for you. But anyway, before we get going today,
this whole podcast is one big perjury trap. I'll tell you that. But go ahead.
So we want to thank some new supporters: Justin, Nancy, and you, D'Amico, who are all new supporters on Patreon. Also, Matthew, who recently came back as a supporter. Thank you all so very much. And, I did want to say, Jay, before we get started, there was a late-breaking story that really kind of just is so much more important than anything else. Clearly, this summer captured the imagination of the nation. And, of course, I'm talking about the reflecting pool. And people might not, I don't know if you're aware of this, but actually, Jean Pirro, the U.S. Attorney in Washington, filed a motion yesterday evening to dismiss those felony charges against that former Olympic canoeist who was accused of pulling up a piece of the reflecting pool liner.
Yes.
And apparently in the motion, she said the damage was the result of a botched installation and not vandalism. Shocking, Jay.
All right. Well, justice has been served then.
It's almost like if you award, no bid quickie contracts to someone you get what you pay for, I guess. So that 14.7 or something million, I guess, I don't know. But there we go. I guess at some point we will have a reflecting pool. Pirro's blaming the Interior Department for lying to justice. And, we have to pass the buck, of course. But we all know where the buck doesn't stop. But all right. So this week, the two wars where the U.S. is kind of a direct partner both hit turning points in a way, and they kind of started bleeding into each other in certain ways. And let's start with Iran. I mean, since the U.S. and Israel first attacked Iran nearly 5 months ago now, we've seen strike and counterstrike, announcements of understandings that turn out not to be all that well understood, almost no traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, and of course, big oil price fluctuations. Now, this week, both the U.S. and Iran began another pause in major actions, though, these things don't last very long. By the time you hear this, there'll probably be all sorts of firing going on. But anyway, the Trump administration says, well, it'll give some room for diplomacy, but it doesn't seem to be particularly optimistic, I suppose, especially maybe because Iran says it's not actually negotiating with Washington. And then we had this week those back-to-back meetings on Tuesday with Trump. First, Ukrainian President Zelensky, then Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. And with Zelensky, Trump discussed letting Ukraine build Patriot interceptors as well as reviving peace talks. Now, the meeting with Netanyahu, a bit mysterious, no public appearance, no press, no joint statements. In fact, it's even been reported that Netanyahu had to work just to get on Trump's schedule, which suggests that there's maybe more than a little bit of daylight now between the two. And then finally we get,
go ahead. I was going to say, despite Mondami's promises not to arrest, I think he's still got to lay low a little bit when he's in the States.
Yeah. Well, the other thing I wanted to mention is then, literally hours after Senator Lindsey Graham's funeral, the Senate voted 86-12 to advance that Russia sanctions bill that's now named for him. And supporters are saying, well, it's leverage that could help bring Putin to the table. Skeptics are saying, well, I don't know, it seems to give the president a lot of discretion here, and we're not necessarily crazy about that. So, Jay, I realize it's been a while since we've talked a lot about Ukraine. Why don't we start there? I'm wondering, do you support Ukraine getting a license to build Patriot missiles?
Oh, very much so. Again, I'll preface this because I've been off the show for a while. I don't know that it matters much what I support and don't support, but I think the interests of the world, of the United States, certainly favor that building alliances. And I think I guess I've been pretty much on record throughout this that if the U.S.'s policy is to serve as sort of a global policeman, which you can agree or disagree with. That's a good role. I mean, my position has always been someone will take up that mantle, and if it's not us, it may well be someone who does not have our interests at heart. I think ensuring the integrity of sovereign nations like Ukraine is important, and I'm happy to see the Ukrainians getting that capability. And look, Mike, when this war started, the conventional wisdom was it was going to be over in 3 months, if not 3 weeks. And we are entering into close to the fifth year of that war. And the tide seems to have turned rather appreciably. When Zelensky was here, he was asked about Russian casualties, and you want to give her, let's take it with a grain of salt, but his numbers were 600,000 Russian soldiers dead. That's historically for our country. That's significant. Now, maybe less so for the Russians, right? But that's a big number.
Well, I guess I'm wondering what you make of President Trump kind of vacillating particularly on the interceptor things. I want to move kind of from that broad picture. Yes, I agree with you. We're all for, freedom and sovereign free nations, self-determination and all that good stuff. And, also I'm for, puppies and rainbows and all that. But so earlier this year, President Trump apparently tells Zelensky, we're going to give you a license to make Patriots. That's pretty cool. That way you can't complain that we're not giving them enough. Make them yourself. Okay. Right. But then he has this interview with the Financial Times, I believe, earlier this week. And he says, well, I'm not sure. It's a very extraordinary weapon. We have to be careful who we license to. And also, we don't really license equipment. So I guess I'm wondering what kind of message is that sending? What do you make of that?
Well, I think the message it sends to Putin is, listen, if you want to deal with somebody, deal with me, Trump, right? That's my sense is that Trump is communicating that he holds the strings that can keep Ukraine fighting the war and can help Ukraine win the war. And if Putin wants to negotiate, it will have to go through Washington. No, I think that was probably, that was to some extent always the case, right? Because if we were not giving, no matter the level of support, right, it's essentially the United States that has kept Ukraine in this war. But that makes that message a little clearer to Putin if he is inclined to negotiate.
Well, it's kind of a mixed message, isn't it? Because on the other hand, Trump has been saying, that Europe should focus more on helping Ukraine, and in fact, that is in fact what has happened. And Ukraine's getting more support now from its European allies than from the United States. And it seems like that's what President Trump wanted. So I guess he wants it both ways. He doesn't want to pay the bill, but he does want to be the center of attention and the indispensable man in this.
Well, that doesn't sound like Trump. The center of attention, and I mean, I don't think it's necessarily a mixed message. I think it sort of works both ways, right? It encourages the Europeans to step up and encourages Putin to keep talking to talk to Trump, and that he is sort of the center of attention. And I think both messages are worthwhile.
And so you don't think it's problematic, and maybe you don't. This isn't trying to trick you or anything. You don't think it's problematic that the president might be telling our ostensible ally in Ukraine, at one point, yeah, we're absolutely going to do this, give this to you, and then a little bit later say, well, I don't know. I mean, wouldn't that have potentially make it very difficult for Ukraine to plan its own defense if it doesn't really know what to expect from the United States?
So again, I would suppose so, but this is sort of the language of diplomacy, right? You often have ambiguities, at least public ambiguities, that allow leaders room to maneuver. So I mean, I guess I'm to me the question is, well, how does Zelensky read this? How does Putin read this? And I would think Zelensky reads this as support compared to, if you recall, right, that the popular wisdom was that Trump is in Putin's back pocket and is going to sell out Ukraine and et cetera. Well, again, we're 5 years down the road, and that hasn't happened. I think Trump has a big desire to be seen as the peacemaker, and that informs, in order to do that, he needs to be seen as having this flexibility of well, look, I told Vladimir we're doing this, and then I'm telling Volodymyr we're doing that, and this is how we're gonna get this worked out. I I think that's just kind of Trump being Trump, and I'm there's always also in military situations, and I was thinking about this the other day to some extent when we put this and the Iran war on the schedule. I mean, my caveat is there's a lot I don't know, and I don't know what I don't know, if you follow me, right? And in terms of weapons that we are giving to Ukraine and the serviceability and all that, I don't really know what's being moved there and what capabilities we have. And if I did, I wouldn't go on a podcast and tell people. I think that's something to consider when we take up
It
these kind
feels
of
like a
stories,
dodge
right?
to me. And here's why I say that, because when we've talked about military actions and things under the Biden administration, and briefly when we had the podcast and Donald Trump or Joe Biden was president, it's a little bit of Obama time. I don't recall nearly this amount of kind of reluctance on your part. And I think, you're right, as a general disclaimer, we are people who have been immersed in politics for a long time. We know a lot of stuff, but we're not insiders. We're not there in the Situation Room. We're not there in the West Wing. But that's just a general truth. We can say that once. Let's just say that now. We are not, working at the White House or DOD or DOW, whatever they want to call it. But let's just stipulate that and move on.
Okay.
So
what's the question then?
Well, no, I mean, it just felt to me like it feels to me like they're saying, well, I'll put it this way. It seems like there is, if you look at this on the face of it, there seems to be a lot of evidence that President Trump has somewhat of an incoherent foreign policy. But it feels to me oftentimes, instead of just sort of saying, well, that is a reasonable, a plausible explanation for the information that is available to us, it feels to me like your tendency is to want to say, well, I just don't know.
Right.
And it's a tendency maybe that I haven't seen before, I guess.
Well, I guess when hadn't you seen it before? Because I think I was pretty clear. I mean, when, first of all, in terms of Biden and military exploits, we didn't really have any.
Yeah,
there was the arming of Ukraine, and I think I was all for that throughout, and sort of give them whatever they need. And I don't know what all they need, but give it to them.
Sure. Okay.
And the same thing goes with, with the Russian invasion. Again, my point is sort of that so much of often the popular wisdom in the media when it comes to these things is dramatically wrong, and that's very much been the case with the Ukraine war, where the narrative was, the Russians are going to overrun them in a couple weeks. Well, that didn't happen, thanks in large part to U.S. support, and I credit President Biden for that. But as this is dragged on, sort of there's all these, media reports of you don't have enough drones, they don't have enough drones. And I guess I'm always hesitant to say this is how things are going in a military operation. This is what this means. I mean, diplomatic stuff, it's easier, right? Because there are statements and you can say, okay, this is what they said. And this, news item is that Trump will license them to make the Patriots, which I think, to the extent it sends the message that we are with Ukraine. Again, consider the narrative for quite a while was that Trump was simply going to abandon Ukraine as soon as he was elected. That hasn't happened. I guess, something else I was thinking about when we talk about this.
Well, part of that, though, I think let's stop on that note, because I think we need to think about why that hasn't happened. Now, some could say, well, it is President Trump's steadfast defense of democracy around the world and his great belief in the valor of the Ukrainian people and his love for President Zelensky or whatever. But it's more likely, I would argue, based on what we know from a lifetime of observing Donald Trump, that he waits and kind of sees which way the wind is blowing and then goes there because he is desperate not to be associated with a loser.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And
Okay.
And if you look, there was a lot of bipartisan congressional support for Ukraine, and people like Lindsey Graham, who told Trump, "Listen, this is the side we need to support." So yeah, I'm
okay.
Here's something that occurred to me at the other again as thinking through stuff for this show and commenting on military stuff. So today's August 1st. if you had said, let's transport ourselves back in time to August 1st, 1945. And if you and I had a podcast that people could have, a radio program that people could have huddled around the big radio, fireside chats being over following Roosevelt's death, if they had subbed us in, right, and we had taken up the question of where are we on World War II? Is this going to be are we going to have an invasion of Japan? And one of us had said, I predict within 2 weeks the Japanese will unconditionally surrender. Everyone would have said that's the dumbest, craziest thing I've ever heard. But that's exactly what happened. And the reason they unconditionally surrendered was we dropped 2 atom bombs on us that no one outside of a very few people knew we had. Now, I'm not suggesting that we have some secret super weapon that's going to end Ukraine or Iran. I'm just pointing out.
But you're not suggesting we don't. I wouldn't be surprised if I saw a true social post saying that.
And look, if likewise, if someone had predicted in September of 1989, the Berlin Wall is going to come down in 2 months. That's not lack of military knowledge. That's lack of, again, the economic realities of things we don't know about. So that's why I'm hesitant to say. I mean, I can read into what's going on now, but
yeah, we stipulated that. Can we just stipulate that now and forevermore?
Right.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
We can put a big disclaimer on the show saying that we cannot predict the future. We are just making our best estimations of what will happen based on what we believe to be our quote unquote expertise. And I guess, is that okay? But,
yeah.
Well, let's move on. You mentioned Lindsey Graham, that Russian sanctions bill. I mean, that would put a direct duty of up to 500% for all Russian imports into the U.S. That's not a really big deal because essentially that's at about zero now.
Right.
The much bigger deal are those secondary tariffs of up to 100% on the top 5 purchasers of Russian crude oil and gas. And overwhelmingly, that's China and India. They account for around 89% of Russia's crude oil exports, a little lower on the gas. And there would also be mandatory sanctions on Putin, senior Russian leaders, oligarchs, their family members, state-owned institutions, the Russian financial institutions. There's also in there a national interest waiver the president can use with the sanctions terminating if Russia signs and upholds a peace deal with Ukraine. So what do you think about that Russia sanctions bill, which again has not passed the final vote in the Senate, but seems to be very well on track? I mean, it had like 62 co-sponsors. This thing's passing the Senate. Do you think before we talk about the politics, what do you think about it as a matter of policy?
Oh, I'm all for it. Again, to the extent, I mean, every time I hear about new sanctions on Russia, my first thought is like, haven't we already sanctioned absolutely everything and everyone associated with them? And the answer is, well, maybe not. But if there's further pressure, economic pressure to bring on them, let's do it. I think we've also, when we talk about things like tariffs and so forth, I've often argued that, the classical conservative thought is, well, we're all for free markets and against tariffs. But that said, I still see that type of economic pressure as an important alternative to war and a way to bring pressure in a non-military way that's good. So yeah, I'm all for that. And, my sense is that, like I said earlier, if Zelensky's correct and the Russians have lost 600,000 troops, given the other sanctions that they've had, Russia is would not appear to be in good shape.
Well, yeah, that's certainly true. If we've learned nothing else from both of these wars, is that, and I would have hoped that President Trump's people would have told him this beforehand, that it's a lot tougher to take territory that somebody else is defending their homeland, and we've seen that obviously both with Russia and Ukraine and us in Iran. But I guess for me, the concern, I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you, but when we're talking about these secondary duties, it potentially complicates things for one with China. I mean, because we have all kinds of dealings with China, and we certainly want various other things from them. And then there's India, right? The world's largest democracy, ostensibly a U.S. ally. And so that might complicate things with them. I'm not saying it's a bad idea, but I'm not saying that secondary tariffs are as clear cut as a good thing as kind of the direct tariffs against Russia. But again, we've pretty much gone as far
Right.
as we
We've
can
sort
on
of,
that.
we've reached the bottom of that barrel. There's nothing left to hit, I don't think.
Yeah, exactly. Pretty much. Yeah. And in terms of on the battlefield, I mean, you said, things are certainly better for Ukraine than that. We don't get the sense that Russia is just kind of slowly grinding them into dust. But I mean, Russia still controls about 20% of Ukraine, I believe, and they're making gains, but they're really, really slow. And Ukraine has clearly gotten a lot better at those long-range strikes inside of Russia, especially targeting their energy infrastructure, which is, as far as I'm concerned, a positive development.
Yeah. And again, you mentioned a while back of is the Trump foreign policy on Ukraine incoherent. I mean, I think if you look at the line, right? If you want to look at if this were graphing like you do like stock markets, you would see a rise and a drop and a rise and a drop, but the trend would be a steady rise in support of Ukraine in terms of allowing them weapons and sort of in terms of allowing them weapons that can hit the interior of Russia. Remember a year or so ago, we were talking about, should this be allowed? That, can we tell the Ukrainians, no, you can't use these things for offensive strikes? And it seems to me that the trend is more towards providing more to Ukraine, doing more against Russia, and the gloves coming off. So I mean, I see there's sort of two steps forward, one step back, and I think that's part of a attempt at diplomacy. But I think Trump's also sort of a realist. He tried the diplomatic route with Putin, and then he was, seemingly frustrated that Putin didn't want diplomacy. So here we are, and I don't think it's a bad thing to seek diplomacy. I think it may be futile when you're dealing with people with like Vladimir Putin, and even more so with Iran.
Mm-hmm.
But
I would not characterize Donald Trump as a realist, maybe a fabulist, but not, but okay, that aside.
No, you wouldn't in terms of I guess I don't mean realist in terms of I didn't mean realist as opposed to its opposite being fabulous, right?
No, I mean,
I think he tends to see things as they are.
God, no. I think
so?
Donald Trump absolutely does not do that at all. I think he is living in his own little world, with his own little coterie of people around him who tell him all sorts of things like, sure, yeah, we can take care of Iran in, a few weeks, just like it's just this little bit bigger than Venezuela. No, I completely reject the characterization as Donald Trump as a realist at all. He has been used to for his whole life bending reality to his will. If that makes him a realist in some sense, I suppose so. But no, I don't think so in the standard sense. But anyway,
okay.
So turning to Iran, at this point, one struggles to say anything different. But I'll say this: one difference, I think, is that, well, we're even shorter on interceptors this week than we were last week and the week before that. And that has to affect strategy. It's so tough to get numbers on these. We don't know what we don't know, right? But when we started the war, the best estimates I could find said we'd somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe 2,300 Patriot interceptors. And we've used maybe around 2/3 of them, and the problem here is that because of production constraints, including some that can't be changed, like there's this really weirdly long curing time for the solid fuel propellant in some of the rocket motors. So it usually takes 2 to 3 years between the time there's a production order and a completed interceptor. And the Pentagon's been trying really hard to increase that capacity, and they have this goal of tripling it, but that's by 2030. They'd like to get around 2,000 missiles a year annually by then. And so I feel like that maybe matters moving forward. But aside from that, it just seems to be, a Groundhog Day sort of thing here.
I guess so. I have no way to tell if those numbers are right, wrong, indifferent, right? But to me, it's going back to the realism. Trump has seemed to, at this point, say, well, it doesn't look like the Iranians want to negotiate, so we'll keep pounding them, and eventually either they will or they will essentially be gone, right? I mean, it's there's a
you
limit
better
to,
watch that. You better watch that they essentially will be gone thing, because talk to Vladimir Putin and ask him how easy it is to make a country essentially gone, or its leadership.
Well, it's keep in mind we're not hitting or Ukraine isn't hitting Russia with near the force that we've been hitting Iran. A significant number of their leaders have been killed, and I think if the strikes continue, the likelihood of other of their leaders being killed increases. And one of the complaints Trump said, or it's coming out of the State Department, and again, you can take this with a grain of salt because I certainly do, is that part of the difficulty in negotiation is they don't even know who they're talking to or who's really in charge. And I think that's going to continue. There's only so many. It's sort of I think in authoritarian societies, you tend not to have a real strong bench, sort of for obvious reasons. And I think that bench is being depleted and will be continued to be depleted as long as we keep attacking them.
It sounds like you're a lot more likely to, or a lot more comfortable drawing conclusions about the internal politics of Iran than you are about military strategy of the U.S. And that's fine if it is. Is that maybe a fair statement?
Well, no, I'm saying the more their new supreme leader, the new Ayatollah, has not been seen publicly since the bombing.
Would you be? Okay.
I mean,
here I am at Google Maps. Drop a pin. Yeah, go ahead. And send
right.
this
Well, though wouldn't my point is there's no strong evidence as to who is running Iran. We do know and have confirmed that we have killed their the Ayatollah and quite a number of their generals and their political leadership.
Yeah, but
I think it's not. I don't think it's making stuff up to say if we continue to bomb them, more of them will die. I mean, do I know the exact numbers? No, but at some point, it reaches a situation of there is no one left who is able or willing to take up that mantle, and that seems to be where Trump is at this point, is saying, listen, we're just going to keep bombing until someone wants to come to the table and come up with some sort of palatable deal.
This reminds me so much of many, many years ago. I read a lot of stuff about the Vietnam War, and boy, so much of the stuff sounds so familiar. Just bomb them back into the Stone Age, and we can just do this all through the year. And this has just been proven time and time and time again to not necessarily be the case. And especially I would think as a conservative, you appreciate the value of a certain amount of, I'll call it strategic humility.
Yeah.
Right. Perhaps one of the greatest mistakes you can make is overestimating your own amazingness. And I wonder if maybe you're perhaps erring on the side of just assuming that we can essentially impose our will on Iran, and it's just a matter of if we have the political will to do it.
I think you may be assigning some things to me that I haven't said.
Yeah,
I'm saying if the question is what's Trump's strategy, what's he trying to do, this is the question I'm answering, right?
Got it. Okay.
And I think, I can say I think there's some evidence to support that the more people we bomb, the more people we kill.
Oh yeah.
And so look, does this work in the end? Do we take them out entirely? I don't know. I think that there is evidence to say that we do. And I also think the comparison of Vietnam is inapt, because Vietnam was different in terms of, we're essentially dealing with a civil war in Vietnam, and you had a North Vietnamese army supported by the Chinese, a major player, a major supplier of arms, munitions, all of that. And I don't think you have that same situation here. You have a country that is really pretty isolated. I have no doubt that the Iranians and Russians...
I wasn't clear enough. I wasn't making the analogy based on that in terms of allies and geopolitical status and all that. I was making the analogy based on just the kind of really simple, straight, I think, maybe I'm wrong, really simple, straightforward. I feel like military truth that it is always a lot harder to destroy an enemy on their own ground,
Right.
especially if you're not willing to invade with, with land troops.
Well,
Then
I tend to agree with you. Yeah.
I mean, that's just simply a truth. But anyway, so certainly we will have much more to talk about, both with, I don't think the Iran situation is changing anytime soon, though who knows, right? I mean, maybe we
Right.
do have a super secret weapon or something. I somehow doubt. Let's move on to some domestic politics. 4 months ago, hard to believe, just 4 months ago, President Trump signed an executive order that was focused on tightening the rules for voting by mail. Now, the order, for those who don't recall it in detail, I remember it calls for DHS to build a master list of confirmed citizens in each state and give it to election officials. The Postal Service is not supposed to deliver mail-in or absentee ballots unless the voter appears on a state-provided list of approved mail voters. And it tells the Justice Department to prioritize the prosecution of state and local officials who send ballots to people that the federal government hasn't confirmed as eligible. Well, after that, 23 Democrat-led states and the District of Columbia sued. A district court granted the injunction they sought, and the First Circuit upheld that. This week, the administration appealed to the Supreme Court. Now, the government believes that the executive order is legal, of course, or at least that's what they're arguing, but that's not the argument they're making at this point. At this point, the government's arguing that the case is premature because none of the states, in their view, has suffered any actual injury. Now, the states contend that they have suffered harm, and they point to the money they've already spent on and staff resources they're using to prepare for the implementation of the order. So, Jay, I thought we'd start with the kind of procedural claim here the administration is making, that essentially that this is premature, not just that it's premature, but that also that this injunction imposes serious, in the administration's words, serious irreparable harm on the federal government. Do you think that's right as a matter of law?
So there's a friend. This is interesting because it's something actually that I've looked on a case litigating at the state level in comparison to municipal governments. That there's a body of law that says if a government can't enact its policies, if policies are stopped by an injunction, that it suffers irreparable harm. Now the caveat to that, of course, is that when you're talking about preliminary injunctions, there's 4 factors, and the 2 biggies are likelihood of success on the merits, and then irreparable harm, and then harm to others, and then public interest. But you've got to have the idea. Then this kind of goes more to the success on the merits piece of it, that the enactment that the government is trying to enforce is legitimate in the first place, right? So
right,
there's no irreparable harm in the government being prevented from doing something which it cannot constitutionally do.
Right, because if the government could just simply, if the administration could simply just say, well, this is irreparable harm because we want to do this and the court isn't letting us do this,
then no government action could ever be challenged. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's plainly not the law. Secondly, it's also a little bit of an inversion of the argument in that well, in this case, it's the states who are seeking to enjoin the president rather than the president who's going to court saying, give me an injunction or I'll be irreparably harmed. The states have made their own argument for irreparable harm, as well as, a standing argument based on, hey, we're going to be out money. Now, being out money isn't irreparable harm. The idea is that if you're out money, you can always get paid back later. But the irreparable harm in this case is the intrusion upon the state prerogative to manage its own elections, and the idea that it might not be, if these requirements are in force, it might not be able to effectively manage their upcoming elections.
Yeah, I mean, just to that point, Jay, the district court noted that the states were already, getting ready for elections in March, of course, and the argument, the way the district court saw it, is they couldn't realistically wait for that final federal implementation of the executive order, because that's what the government is saying. It's saying, right, it's premature because if you take a look at the EO, we have that, and this is boilerplate in these things, consistent with applicable law, right?
Yeah.
So they're saying, well, it's not like we can violate any laws because that's there in the EO, but the states are saying, well, which is why I think the point I'm making here is that elections are sort of different in a way because you have this, you have this deadline here, and so that can't change, and you have to have that amount of lead time to make sure that the elections aren't thrown into chaos. And it is something that courts consider when they're looking at, changes to election law procedures right before elections.
Yeah, and there's a fairly lengthy body of case law on that, on elections and irreparable harm that goes to that listen, if otherwise that changing election laws too close to an election does cause irreparable harm to the voters, I would suppose confusion, but in the state's ability to implement. So yeah, I don't disagree that's a legitimate irreparable harm, and the district court said so as well. And you're right, the appeal turned more on standing, which I don't think is a great argument. I think the states have the better argument here.
And I will say I'm a little more sympathetic to the second irreparable harm argument that I see the government is making. You mentioned that one already, that kind of sort of blanket, we want to just carry out in general a lawful policy, and if we can't do that. But specifically, if we take the administration's claims that, this is a real issue, that this executive order is designed to mitigate, right? And so the harm it's going to suffer is the permanent loss of the opportunity to apply this policy to the upcoming midterms. And if they don't, well, that if there is a legitimate issue with fraud, with non-citizens voting, well, that's a big problem, right? Election integrity.
Absolutely. Yeah.
If that were the case, but the problem I think is that the administration in its legal filings hasn't given any demonstration of this. They just essentially stated it and just said, trust us on this, which
and
is
in
problematic.
These injunction hearings, you need to make a strong showing, right? A success on the likelihood of the merits, because the way courts look at this, this is sort of the boilerplate language that in every injunction, in every rule, in every injunction, is there is a line that says, a preliminary injunction is extraordinary relief. Now, it's probably not really extraordinary because it happens all the time. But the idea is that this is not just a run-of-the-mill court decision. This is a big deal, enjoining someone from doing something, whether it's enjoining the government from enforcing the law or enjoining some other party from just carrying on their lives. Courts typically don't, their legal authorities tends to be to compensate. Rather than to preemptively do something. So when they are doing something preemptively, it is a big deal, and it requires, let's say, an extraordinary showing. But at this point, I think you're right. There's not a significant showing. Now, I would also I could make the argument I think there are parts of the executive order that probably don't run afoul of that. If you want to order DHS to collect information, I think that's an executive prerogative, and they can give it to the states and they can do what they want with it. The difficulty comes more in the potential prosecution. This is something the courts talked about too, of state officials if they're not complying or seen as complying with the federal mandates. So if you're asking me where I come out on this, and people might think this is in a lot of ways, I think the policy behind this I think is probably a good one, but where I disagree, and where the courts disagree too, is, our Constitution commits voting practices and procedures largely to the states. There are places where the federal government weighs in, and there are certain baseline guarantees that the federal government provides. But in terms of the when, how, methods of voting, that is largely left to the states. And I think most traditional conservatives like myself would say that's a good thing. That's sort of the guarantor of liberty. So,
I'll say that the district court. I thought the district court got a large right on the substance. We're kind of moving into that a little bit.
The district court did much more addressing the substance because the other issues weren't necessarily raised on appeal.
Yeah, but the district court says, listen, there's the election clause, and this gives Congress, not the president, the authority to impose election requirements. And yes, the president does have that take care authority, but that allows him to execute laws, not to create a new system of federal election procedures using executive orders. I mean, this really feels a lot like the president trying to use an executive order when what he actually needs is legislation. And
Well,
adding
I
on to
would
that, I'll
agree.
say,
Yeah.
when the First Circuit looked at this, they said, also, we feel like this order intrudes on the state's sovereign authority to establish and administer their own election laws. And that's kind of part and parcel with that.
Yeah. That's sort of, I think that's what I said. And I look, I think you're right on the statutory thing. I think you need to get past that other state sovereign piece first before you even get to what can Congress do. Like I said, Congress can do things in terms of federal elections, but I don't think it's let's put it this way. One, it still has to yield to those state sovereignty issues, and second, it hasn't done any of those things.
Right. All right. Any other thoughts on that? I know how you feel about voting by mail in general.
No, like I said, from a policy standpoint, I think it's, I think there's a lot to recommend it, and I've voiced concerns many times that a lot of states vote by mail methods are invitations to fraud. Some states do a better job than others, but the bigger point is it's up to the states to do that.
Right.
Right.
Absent
and I would heartily recommend stronger state statutes in a lot of these places, and I would support federal support of those state statutes, right? I mean, in terms of making information available, that sort of thing. But this goes sort of, again, to traditional conservatism. Even if it's your guy who's doing it, the idea that you can just rule by fiat is
I'm with you.
Not consistent with the Constitution, especially in this area where there's sort of a double carve out, right?
Yeah, definitely. All right, then. Well, I have disagreements with you about that. As a matter of policy, I won't relitigate that here. I do want to get to one more thing.
There'll be time to do that later. There will be other days, but
absolutely. Let's turn to someone we haven't talked about in a while, Anthony Fauci. This week,
what's he been
Fauci,
up to?
The former head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, as well as, of course, the public face of the government's COVID response, appeared under subpoena before the Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee, chaired by Kentucky Senator Rand Paul. Now, as Jay alluded to there in the opening, Fauci refused to answer questions, invoking his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination more than 100 times. Now, the hearing followed Paul's release the weekend before of more than 1,100 pages of what appear to be Fauci's private diaries from 2019 through 2022. And Paul points to entries where Fauci privately noted early in 2020 things like the Wuhan market was not the source of the virus, but an amplifier, and that on an early scientific call, most participants thought that a lab origin was possible. And he argues that these notes contradict Fauci's public reassurances, and that the entries also show Fauci very clearly dwelling on his own celebrity, sometimes cringingly so. Now, before leaving office, President Biden gave Fauci a sweeping preemptive pardon covering his government work through January of 2025. Paul says the diaries prove years of sort of public versus private contradictions and claims that Fauci destroyed records. He says, well, I'm pardoned. That blocks every old charge. So the only reason to draw me or call me in here under oath is to, set up some kind of a perjury trap. Democrats are saying this is Rand Paul's vendetta. Senator Paul saying this is oversight. Jay, what do you think? I mean, I guess it could be both,
yes,
right?
Yes, and yes.
Combine your oversight with some vendetta.
Yes, I think it is. It's a perjury trap. Yes, it's a vendetta, and yes, it's oversight.
Yeah.
I don't think any of those have to be mutually exclusive. In fact, oversight's better when it's a vendetta almost. But no, I think there were important questions, and it is a good thing to ask them on the perjury piece. Now, this is something I would probably depart from some of my Republican colleagues. I've said time again on this show, I think lawfare is a problem. It's wrong, and regardless who does it. There could be a convincing argument that Fauci is guilty of a serious criminal defense. I haven't seen it yet, and given the pardon, it's unlikely that I ever would.
Right.
Because to my sense, right, is there was something improper, criminal, that you could somehow hold him responsible for COVID deaths. I think that would have occurred during that period, and not, would be subject to the pardon anyway. I also, I don't like the idea of Republicans or any government official picking someone out and saying this person ought to be put in jail. One, either because he did a bad job or because he's a bad person. It has to be because you committed an illegal act, and that's what I don't see right yet. Right? I mean, I think I could go on that. I think.
And this feels. I'll say on that, Jay. It feels like RFK Jr., who's heading HHS now, so the parent organization, says it took him his people. Obviously, he wasn't sitting there in front of the keyboard, but 8 months to extract all of the diaries they had dug out of 11 separate servers, which, talk about that. That sounds like a very determined record search, right? And even though they knew that there would be nothing prosecutable because of the pardon there. And as you point out, even with that, there appears to be no smoking guns, nothing in the notes that clearly contradicts sort of a contemporaneous public statement from Fauci. There's clearly a gap, right, between his private thinking and his public comments.
And like I said, I think the remedy for that is a political remedy, not a legal criminal one.
Well, here, to me, so these diaries are clearly private notes, right? And why did he make? Well, who knows? He wrote a memoir in 2024. Maybe it was for that, other reasons, but there's no way he would have written some of the things that he realized, like, wow, what a great day I was on 05 Sunday shows. Isn't life wonderful? As people are dropping dead, right? This is not the kind of thing you write in a public record unless you're completely unhinged. And so I'll say, I feel like people are making way too much of Fauci being kind of starstruck by his celebrity. My God, who wouldn't be put in that situation? And so I think I understand why it's happening, but I think that's just kind of unimportant and ridiculous, the kind of eye-rolling stuff. The important stuff is, did he actually lie? Did he actually destroy records? And I don't think that this gives us any basis to say that he did, or even have a really clear idea that he did.
Yeah, so I would partially agree with you, because I do think the diaries are important in that there's a sense of that one's diary is more candid than one's public statements. If he writes the diary, there would be no incentive for him to sort of lie, obscure the truth to himself. And secondly, if he's doing it with an eye on writing a memoir, he's likely seeking to cast himself in the best possible light. And again, that's not to say that I'm seeing something criminal here, but what I do see is this sense of being starstruck, of being, wow, look at me, and maybe you can say that temptation would be too much for anyone to bear, which I think raises the actual conservative point, right? that absolute power corrupts, and I don't know, perhaps absolute celebrity does something similar. And the troubling thing to me is, when we talk about things like the lab leak theory, he clearly went out of his way to discredit that, to discredit other folks who said, hey, mightn't this, virus have come from the one institute that happens to be studying those viruses that's, right down the road. And those folks were ridiculed. People lost their jobs, and it was his diaries tend to show that he did not discount those lab leak theories privately, but when he saw that that's the way the wind was blowing. And I will conjecture, right? I think there were some serious concerns about what the NSAID did in terms of funding gain of function research, that he had an incentive to keep that under wraps. Now, again, I'm not saying that's criminal, and I reject the idea that, and in fact, I'm a little bit troubled by the idea, this is strategically, right, of threatening criminal prosecution and saying you're going to go to jail. If I were Congress, what I would do is give him absolute immunity.
I was going to say that,
to everything, and then you can't take the fifth. Because to me, whether or not, Fauci gets indicted and sort of 6 months a house arrest or something is sort of inconsequential compared to getting the bigger story. And part of that story is how were American tax dollars spent, how in terms of how do they end up in a lab in Wuhan, and what was the origin of the virus? Could something have been done sooner if that origin story hadn't been complicated or obscured?
And we don't know with any certainty what the origin is, just to be clear on that.
Well, I think you've got the various federal agencies. NSA has said that they have high confidence that it came out of there was a lab leak, as opposed to.
Let me just stop you right there. I am fairly certain they said that it was low to moderate confidence and not high confidence, but we can certainly fact check that.
Up. Yeah.
But I am fairly certain, and let's say we won't stop things here for that, but I am fairly certain that it is in fact low to moderate confidence and not high confidence, and that anyway. But
why? I guess this is
But I guess the point of this is essentially the larger point is kind of political theater. I mean, there's this weird argument that Senator Paul is making, right? Saying, well, Fauci can't refuse to testify because his pardon gives him immunity, so he can't incriminate himself. But at the same time, Paul has said, hey, if he lies during the testimony, well, that's not covered by the pardon. And oh, by the way, I am going to work on a contempt of Congress vote and go ahead and send it over to DOJ once we get it, if we do in fact get it. And given the fact that DOJ was willing to indict Jim Comey for seashells, a picture of seashells on Instagram, I feel like, Blanche would full steam ahead on this.
That could be right, and again, I think that ends up going nowhere because of the pardon. Yeah. I would agree with Rand Paul that I think you can say future lying to Congress could impose liability, but he hasn't done that. And I think the pardon to me covers most everything involved in the timeline that really matters.
Yeah.
For any criminal culpability.
Now there are some people saying that. During the hearings, it was just basically just a litany of cheap shots, right? Bernie Moreno, our senator, one of our senators from Ohio, kept it classy with, who the F do you think you were for doing that? And then I feel like Tommy Tuberville said, well, just hold my beer, Bernie, for a second. And then he goes on Fox Business and says, Fauci killed 9 million people and that he can prove it, apparently, I don't know. And then he says he's going to try to find a way to put Fauci on trial and jail him on state charges. So the trial is just for show, apparently, if he becomes Alabama's next governor, and somehow that puts him in charge, I think. But I believe, I want to say Florida, there was a move in Florida to do that as well. I'm sure you just think that this is not great stuff.
No, I'm going to make a larger point here that, again, for the, speaking as a traditional conservative, small c conservative movement, to me, the biggest, if I'm strategizing here, the biggest thing that we can do, the best thing that you could do is not this whole criminal bit, which one I think is probably a little far-fetched. 2, you're not really going to get there. 3, even if you get a conviction, it's going to be sort of a so what conviction. You're not going to convict him of killing 9 million people. The more important ideological and political point to make, the flag to plant, is look, everybody, this is why we ought to be skeptical of rule by experts, because experts are human and are as fallible as anyone else and are subject to the same frailties in terms of wanting to burnish their own image. They're not immune to being suckered in by their own press clippings. And that's why there is a, we said this wasn't any secret, right? The I am the science, the Ella Louis XIV statement that we ought to be skeptical. And that's the big lesson of science itself, right? Is skepticism. And I think it's troubling that he sort of went out of his way to silence other voices who were skeptical of him just because they were skeptical of him after he is receiving all this press adulation.
I mean, that's politics, right? This was a political, partly, certainly
right.
a political, and the idea that people would think that this wouldn't be political is just bizarre to me, especially with the stakes were as high as they were.
Yeah. Yeah,
in the early days
and
of the
again,
pandemic.
that's why I push against the. I'm fine saying, yeah, these are political decisions and political calculations, but that's why I don't believe in the objective expert, because I just don't think there is such an animal.
And you would feel the same way even when we're talking about, say, foreign policy or war, right? So you feel like we should be properly.
Even more so, I would say
So we
even
should be
more so
skeptical of
because
what Donald Trump says about Iran and what he's doing in the war and those kind of claims.
well, the difference is, one, Trump is saying this as a political leader, right? With political accountability. And I would say things like foreign policy and war are less subject even to the rule of experts, because there's less objective measures that can be made, right? There's less science there. I think it is, those are political decisions. They're messy decisions. And at the end, those political leaders have some sort of
Yeah.
accountability. Typically, well, I mean, perhaps Trump doesn't, being a lame duck president, but you have sort of judgment of history type stuff that you worry about.
Yeah, I feel like
But
a lot of
that's
it.
the point. Is with those things, they're political leaders and there's political accountability.
I guess I feel like it's easy to forget how insane things were back then and how much was happening so quickly, and how many people were, getting sick and dying. And in that environment, it's like, when you watch football, right, and you watch the slow motion replay of the quarterback taking the sack and said, "Why didn't you see that guy coming over the middle?" Well, it's like, there were five guys in his face, and he was trying to
Right.
do 1,000 things at once. And this is really tough, really challenging, and that's why when you say, obviously. That's why I said contemporaneous when saying that, if we wanted to look at his statements, we have to say, well, what was he saying contemporaneously, publicly, and privately? Because things moved so quickly and there was so much we didn't know and had to learn very quickly. And it was super important to get people to, well, number one, to make sure people didn't die, and number two, to not make people panic. And it was a rough situation, and no one was fully prepared for that. That's not to vindicate Fauci and everything he did, but I'm just saying that I think everyone deserves to be graded a little bit on a curve for the COVID response.
I would agree with that. I think if you went back and listened to some of our podcasts and things that I said at the time, they were sort of that style, right? That, listen, everybody's doing the best they can in a rapidly evolving situation. Why this is important, why these diaries are important, and I particularly point to the lab leak piece of it, is that it tends to show that Fauci contemporaneously knew or believed that a lab leak was a high potential possibility, and yet took steps to undercut that story or that research into that, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's what I'm saying is important. So I think most people would be willing to give benefit of the doubt of hey, things were moving quickly. Everybody was doing the best they could with the information they had. And that's why it's important to sort of get a sense of what information did they have.
Yeah. I just make one correction there. I would say there's no indication he thought it was a high possibility, but certainly that it wasn't impossible. And the public statements were more definitive and clear than the very, very messy reality of it.
All right.
Okay. Well, I'll say one thing to kind of close this out. There's a personal lesson here for everyone, really, not just Anthony Fauci. If you're using your employer's computer, you should assume they have access to everything. If you want
Don't
to
write
take
your
personal
personal
notes,
diary.
yeah, go out to Best Buy, get yourself a MacBook or a ThinkPad or something, and do it on your own computer.
Better yet, build your own server.
There you go, Betsy. What could possibly go wrong? All right. Well, on that note, I think we will close things out for today. But if there's anything Jay and I talked about that made an impression, whether you loved it, hated it, just got a question for us, we would love to hear from you. Just email us from mail@politicsguys.com, or you can reach out through Facebook, X, or our supporters Discord. All the links are in the show notes. And of course, I am on our Discord way more than I probably should be. Now, if you're getting value from the show and you want to support what we do, the best way to do that is through Patreon. You can even start with a free trial. And if you're supporting, you get ad-free episodes, the full midweek show instead of just a preview, and access to that Discord with even more benefits at higher levels of support. And if Patreon isn't your thing, well, we also have PayPal and Venmo with all those links in the show notes and at politicsguys.com/support. And if you'd like that full midweek show, but you can't support us financially right now, not a problem. Send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will get that set up for you. And whether you support us or not, it's a big, big help if you can subscribe, rate, and review the show wherever you listen, as well as sharing episodes. And as always, before we go, a special thanks to our wonderful executive producers. They are Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, Brian Matza, Jody Marie Miller, and Sean Fugate. We'll be back with a new episode next week. We hope you'll join us.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,